Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to the Neo-Fusionist Book Review. This is not your typical book review, as I make no claims to political or philosophical impartiality. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the premise of Neo-Fusionism. Neo-Fusionism is the merging of paleoconservatism with naturalism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, economics, and sociology through a wide variety of books published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. Today's episode, we are going to be looking at Pragmatism by William James. This book was published originally in 1907, so it's over 100 years old. It was originally delivered as a series of lectures in Boston in 1906, and was then published the following year in book form. Before we get into the details of this book, I do want to take a moment to do a quick review of where we've been so far. So we opened up with the book Liberty and Tyranny by Mark Levin, and looked at some conservative ideas that are popular nowadays that I wanted to refute a few of those points, not because I want to refute conservatism as a whole, but because I wanted to distinguish paleoconservatism, and particularly my specific interpretation of paleoconservatism, with more of a sort of a boilerplate conservatism presented by Mark Levin. I did that in the episode Day of Reckoning by Pat Buchanan. We looked at some political ideas that I'm more closely aligned to, and Pat Buchanan's sort of a paleoconservative icon, and so I wanted to let him sort of lay the framework for where we're going to be going in the political direction. There'll be a lot more to discuss on that down the road, but I wanted to also talk a little bit about naturalism. So likewise, I opened up with a book, Encountering Naturalism by Thomas Clark, that had drew some implications from naturalism that I thought were incorrectly drawn implications, a lot of generally political implications. So then I said, well, I need to zero in on naturalism that's more close to what I'm looking for. So it took us a couple episodes to kind of paint that picture. I started with No Choice Theory by Ahmad Safavi, and that kind of presented a strict determinism, which I use to kind of lay the foundation for naturalism. Naturalism being the idea that every material effect has a material cause, a natural material cause, and so there is no supernatural. And the implication of everything being a natural material phenomenon caused by previous natural material phenomena creates generally a clockwork deterministic universe, where the rule of cause and effect controls absolutely everything, right down to the behaviors of humans. But in order to zero in a little more closely, I wanted to look at evolution, and then followed that up with a classic book, The Blank Slate by Steven Pinker, which zeroed in a little bit more specifically on the concept of human nature, and an assertion that we have human nature. And especially I focused on an interesting aspect of the case for human nature, which was that in the 1970s and after that, but especially in the 70s, when the explorations of human nature really started to come about, there was a big pushback from the left. And this is a scientific evolutionary understanding of humanity, and the left pushed back against that. And I think that there's a phenomena where the left likes evolution insofar as it serves as a weapon to use against creationism, and more particularly against Christians and Christianity. And well, so be it. But the implications of evolution are implications that the left doesn't necessarily want to hear or want to take into consideration. And so we talked a little bit about that in that episode. That was last episode, The Blank Slate by Steven Pinker. And so now I feel like we've kind of landed ourselves about where we want to be from a naturalistic perspective, evolution, human nature. A lot of this show is going to explore evolutionary psychology and exploration of human nature. And so to lay out a foundation that, yes, there is a human nature and it is determined largely by evolution in combination with the environment within which humans have evolved, is an important one to make. So with that said, I'm going to begin to move in a different direction with this episode. We're going to begin to explore some more philosophy and step away from the science a little bit. And we're not going to unchain ourselves from science, but we're going to look at some of the history of some philosophical ideas and some of the political implications of those ideas, because there are always political implications to concepts about the nature of reality. So I feel like a good place to start in our philosophical exploration is this book here. And there were a number of different places that I could have started at, but I felt like he makes a few points here that I really think are important and are going to serve us well in our exploration. So this would be a great time to just crack this open and explore it. Now, pragmatism is an American philosophy. It is kind of considered the American philosophy. Most philosophies of any renown come from the UK or continental Europe. In Western philosophy, that's kind of the root are these old world philosophies, and pragmatism was the first and really the only major philosophy to arise in the New World, which is nice. It gives it an especially American appeal. Now, pragmatism sometimes gets a bad rap. It has often been associated with progressives. It has often been associated with John Dewey and other progressive reformers and thinkers. It's often associated with relativism. And I'm going to get into some of that in this episode. We're going to see what there is of value in pragmatism, because I think there are things of value. I think there are components of pragmatism that can be used in a conservative political philosophy, and that can especially be of value to us in our exploration and creation of a framework for our neo-fusionist beliefs. So, without any further ado, let's look in here more specifically. So he opens up with a section that I want to read. It's pretty early on. So there are a number of lectures, right? It's not all one lecture. It's a series of lectures that he presents. The first lecture is called The Present Dilemma in Philosophy. And I want to read a few portions of that. He introduces a concept right off the bat that we're going to grab and run with. We're going to be exploring this or some variation of this concept multiple times through the course of this podcast in different books that we look at. But we'll approach this through William James's perspective. He says, quote, "Philosophy is at once the most sublime and the most trivial of human pursuits. It works in the minutest crannies, and it opens out the widest vistas. It bakes no bread, as has been said, but it can inspire our souls with courage. And repugnant as its manners, its doubting and challenging, its quibbling and dialectics often are to common people, no one of us can get along without the far-flashing beams of light it sends over the world's perspectives. These illuminations, at least, and the contrast effects of darkness and mystery that accompany them, give to what it says an interest that is much more than professional. The history of philosophy is to a great extent that of a certain clash of human temperaments. Undignified as such a treatment may seem to some of my colleagues, I shall have to take account of this clash, and explain a good many of the divergencies of philosophers by it. Of whatever temperament a professional philosopher is, he tries, when philosophizing, to sink the fact of his temperament. Temperament is no conventionally recognized reason, so he urges impersonal reasons only for his conclusions. Yet his temperament really gives him a stronger bias than any of his more strictly objective premises. It loads the evidence for him one way or the other, making for a more sentimental or a more hard-hearted view of the universe, just as this fact or that principle would. He trusts his temperament. Wanting a universe that suits it, he believes in any representation of the universe that does suit it. He feels men of opposite temper to be out of key with the world's character, and in his heart considers them incompetent and not in it in the philosophic business, even though they may far excel him in dialectical ability. Yet in the forum he can make no claim, on the bare ground of his temperament, to superior discernment or authority. There arises thus a certain insincerity in our philosophic discussions. The potentest of all our premises is never mentioned. I am sure it would contribute to clearness if in these lectures we should break this rule and mention it, and I accordingly feel free to do so. Of course, I'm talking here of very positively marked men of radical idiosyncrasy, who have set their stamp and likeness on philosophy and figure in its history. Plato, Locke, Hegel, Spencer are such temperamental thinkers. Most of us have, of course, no very definite intellectual temperament. We are a mixture of opposite ingredients, each one present very moderately. We hardly know our own preferences in abstract matters. Some of us are easily talked out of them, and end by following the fashion or taking up with the beliefs of the most impressive philosopher in our neighborhood, whoever he may be. But the one thing that has counted so far in philosophy is that a man should see things, see them straight in his own peculiar way, and be dissatisfied with any opposite way of seeing them. There is no reason to suppose that this strong temperamental vision is from now onward to count no longer in the history of man's beliefs. Now, the particular difference of temperament that I have in mind in making these remarks is one that is counted in literature, art, government, and manners, as well as in philosophy. In manners, we find formalists and free and easy persons. In government, authoritarians and anarchists. In literature, purists or academicals and realists. In art, classics and romantics. You recognize these contrasts as familiar. Well, in philosophy, we have a very similar contrast expressed in the pair of terms rationalist and empiricist. Empiricist, meaning your lover of facts in all their crude variety. Rationalist, meaning your devotee to abstract and eternal principles. No one can live an hour without both facts and principles, so it is a difference rather of emphasis. Yet it breeds antipathies of the most pungent character between those who lay the emphasis differently. And we shall find it extraordinarily convenient to express a certain contrast in men's ways of taking their universe, by talking of the empiricist and of the rationalist temper. These terms make the contrast simple and massive. More simple and massive than are usually the men of whom the terms are predicated, for every sort of permutation and combination is possible in human nature. And if I now proceed to define more fully what I have in mind when I speak of rationalists and empiricists, by adding to each of those titles some secondary qualifying characteristics, I beg you to regard my conduct as to a certain extent arbitrary. I select types of combinations that nature offers very frequently, but by no means uniformly, and I select them solely for their convenience in helping me to my ulterior purpose of characterizing pragmatism. Historically, we find the terms intellectualism and sensationalism used as synonyms of rationalism and empiricism. While nature seems to combine most frequently with intellectualism and idealist and optimistic tendency, empiricists, on the other hand, are not uncommonly materialistic, and their optimism is apt to be decidedly conditional and tremulous. Rationalism is always monistic. It starts from wholes and universals and makes much of the unity of things. Empiricism starts from the parts and makes of the whole a collection, is not averse, therefore, to calling itself pluralistic. Rationalism usually considers itself more religious than empiricism, but there is much to say about this claim, so I merely mention it. It is a true claim when the individual rationalist is what is called a man of feeling, and when the individual empiricist prides himself on being hard-headed. In that case, the rationalist will usually also be in favor of what is called free will, and the empiricist will be a fatalist. I use the terms most popularly current. The rationalist, finally, will be of dogmatic temper in his affirmations, while the empiricist may be more skeptical and open to discussion. He says, quote, "A few of us are tenderfoot Bostonians, pure and simple, and a few are Rocky Mountain toughs in philosophy. Most of us have a hankering for the good things on both sides of the line. Facts are good, of course. Give us lots of facts. Principles are good. Give us plenty of principles. The world is indubitably one if you look at it in one way, but as indubitably it is many if you look at it in another. It is both one and many. Let us adopt a sort of pluralistic monism. Everything, of course, is necessarily determined, and yet, of course, our wills are free. A sort of free will determinism is the true philosophy. The evil of the parts is undeniable, but the whole can't be evil, so practical pessimism may be combined with metaphysical optimism." And so forth. Your ordinary philosophic layman, never being a radical, never straightening out his system, but living vaguely in one plausible compartment of it or another to suit the temptations of successive hours. But some of us are more than mere laymen in philosophy. We are worthy of the name of amateur athletes, and are vexed by too much inconsistency and vacillation in our creed. We cannot preserve a good intellectual conscience so long as we keep mixing incompatibles from opposite sides of the line. And now I come to the first positively important point which I wish to make. Never were as many men of a decidedly empiricist proclivity in existence as there are at the present day. Our children, one may say, are almost born scientific. But our esteem for facts has not neutralized in us all religiousness. It is itself almost religious. Our scientific temper is devout. Now, take a man of this type, and let him also be a philosophic amateur, unwilling to mix a hodgepodge system after the fashion of a common layman, and what does he find his situation to be in this blessed year of our Lord 1906? He wants facts, he wants science, but he also wants a religion. And being an amateur and not an independent originator in philosophy, he naturally looks for guidance to the experts and professionals, whom he already finds in the field. A very large number of you here present, perhaps a majority of you, are amateurs of just this sort. Now, what kinds of philosophy do you find actually offered to meet your need? You find an empirical philosophy that is not religious enough, and a religious philosophy that is not empirical enough for your purpose. If you look to the quarter where facts are most considered, you find the whole tough-minded program in operation, and the conflict between science and religion in full blast. Either it is that Rocky Mountain tough of a Haeckel with his materialistic monism, his ether god, and his jest at your god as a gaseous vertebrate, or it is Spencer treating the world's history as a redistribution of matter and motion solely, and bowing religion politely out the front door. She may indeed continue to exist, but she must never show her face inside the temple. For 150 years past, the progress of science has seemed to mean the enlargement of the material universe and the diminution of man's importance. The result is what one may call the growth of naturalistic or positivistic feeling. Man is no lawgiver to nature, he is an absorber. She it is who stands firm, he it is who must accommodate himself. Let him record truth, inhuman though it be, and submit to it. The romantic spontaneity and courage are gone. The vision is materialistic and depressing. Ideals appear as inert byproducts of physiology. What is higher is explained by what is lower, and treated forever as a case of nothing but something else of a quite inferior sort. You get, in short, a materialistic universe, in which only the tough-minded find themselves congenially at home. If now, on the other hand, you turn to the religious quarter for consolation, and take counsel of the tender-minded philosophies, what do you find? Religious philosophy in our day and generation is, among us English-reading people, of two main types. One of these is more radical and aggressive, the other has more the air of fighting a slow retreat. But the more radical wing of religious philosophy, by the more radical wing of religious philosophy, I mean the so-called transcendental idealism of the Anglo-Hegelian school, the philosophy of such men as Green, the Cairds, Bosanquet, and Royce. This philosophy has greatly influenced the more studious members of our Protestant ministry. It is pantheistic, and undoubtedly it has already blunted the edge of the traditional theism in Protestantism at large. That theism remains, however. It is the lineal descendant, through one stage of concession after another, of the dogmatic scholastic theism still taught rigorously in the seminaries of the Catholic Church. For a long time it used to be called among us the philosophy of the Scottish school. It is what I meant by the philosophy that has the air of fighting a slow retreat. Between the encroachments of the Hegelians and other philosophers of the absolute on the one hand, and those of the scientific evolutionists and agnostics on the other, the men that give us this kind of philosophy, James Martineau, Professor Brown, Professor Ladd, and others, must feel themselves rather tightly squeezed. Fair-minded and candid as you like, this philosophy is not radical in temper. It is eclectic, a thing of compromises, that seeks a modus vivendi above all things. It accepts the facts of Darwinism, the facts of cerebral physiology, but it does nothing active or enthusiasm with them. It lacks the victorious and aggressive note. It lacks prestige in consequence, whereas absolutism has a certain prestige due to the more radical style of it. These two systems are what you have to choose from if you turn to the tender-minded school. And if you are the lovers of facts I have supposed you to be, you find the trail of the serpent of rationalism, of intellectualism, over everything that lies on that side of the line. You escape, indeed, the materialism that goes with the reigning empiricism, but you pay for your escape by losing contact with the concrete parts of life. The more absolutist philosophers dwell on so high a level of abstraction that they never even try to come down. The absolute mind which they offer us, the mind that makes our universe by thinking it, might, for aught they show us to the contrary, have made any one of a million other universes just as well as this. You can deduce no single actual particular from the notion of it. It is compatible with any state of things, whatever being true here below. And the theistic God is almost as sterile a principle. You have to go to the world which he has created to get any inkling of his actual character. He is the kind of God that has once for all made that kind of a world. The God of the theistic writers lives on as purely abstract heights as does the absolute. Absolutism has a certain sweep and dash about it, while the usual theism is more insipid, but both are equally remote and vacuous. What you want is a philosophy that will not only exercise your powers of intellectual abstraction, but that will make some positive connection with this actual world of finite human lives. You want a system that will combine both things, the scientific loyalty to facts and willingness to take account of them, the spirit of adaptation and accommodation, in short, but also the old confidence in human values and the resultant spontaneity, whether of the religious or of the romantic type. And this is then your dilemma. You find the two parts of your quasitum hopelessly separated. You find empiricism with inhumanism and irreligion, or else you find a rationalistic philosophy that indeed may call itself religious, but that keeps out of all definite touch with concrete facts and joys and sorrows. End quote. So we see there the introduction of the tough-minded and the tender-minded, the rationalist and the empiricist, the rationalist being the tender-minded and the empiricist being the tough-minded. He also, I didn't read this section, but he does go on and list a few words, adjectives that could define the tender-minded and a few that could define the tough-minded. He just kind of groups these together in order to create a sort of an arbitrary division. Well, I wouldn't call it arbitrary, but I would call it maybe exaggerated. The tender-minded he gives the qualities of rationalistic, intellectualistic, idealistic, optimistic, religious, free willist, monistic, and dogmatical. Whereas the tough-minded empiricist, he gives the notions of sensationalistic, materialistic, pessimistic, irreligious, fatalistic, pluralistic, and skeptical. So one is going by principles and ideas as the true path to knowledge, and the other is going by facts and observations and the material world as the true path to knowledge. That distinction between those tough-minded and tender-minded is a distinction that we're going to come back to repeatedly. We'll be looking at Plato and Aristotle, and we can find traces of that same distinction in them. And we'll be going into that in some detail. And we're going to carry on this sort of dichotomy. Now, you're going to find a bunch of different sort of dichotomies that are similar but not quite the same. And you could even look back at our previous exploration of The Blank Slate by Steven Pinker, and you could say, well, the people who believe in the blank slate theory and believe in the ghost in the machine and the noble savage could be grouped with the tender-minded. They believe in ideas as the greatest thing, and so that people can find whatever idea is the perfect idea. It's a search for perfect, morally correct, and intellectually correct ideas. Whereas the believer in a material human nature, in other words, a human nature built by the biological structure of the brain, they're going to be the tough-minded and the empirical, and they're going to say, these lofty utopian dreams of crafting human nature like clay is not compatible with the material reality in which we find ourselves. That is the tough-minded approach. And so that same dichotomy we can kind of find in this book, and we'll find in future books, and we'll explore in more detail. So with that said, that's not really the whole crux of this book. That is an idea that I wanted to point out, but we'll be getting into the meat of this book and its core ideas of pragmatism shortly. There's one other section, though, before we really get into it. In this same introductory lecture, he talks a little bit about the value of philosophy to the common man, and what philosophy seeks and what it should seek. And I like this section, and I'm going to read it to you now. He says, quote, "I find a fine example of revolt against the airy and shallow optimism of current religious philosophy in a publication of that valiant anarchist writer Morrison I. Swift. Mr. Swift's anarchism goes a little farther than mine does, but I confess that I sympathize a good deal, and some of you, I know, will sympathize heartily with his dissatisfaction with the idealistic optimisms now in vogue. He begins his pamphlet on human submission with a series of city reporters' items from newspapers, suicides, deaths from starvation, and the like, as specimens of our civilized regime. For instance, quote, after trudging through the snow from one end of the city to the other, in the vain hope of securing employment, and with his wife and 6 children without food, and ordered to leave their home in an Upper East Side tenement house because of non-payment of rent, John Corcoran, a clerk, today ended his life by drinking carbolic acid. Corcoran lost his position 3 weeks ago through illness, and during the period of idleness, his scanty savings disappeared. Yesterday, he obtained work with a gang of city snow shovelers, but he was too weak from illness and was forced to quit after an hour's trial with the shovel. Then the weary task of looking for employment was again resumed. Thoroughly discouraged, Corcoran returned to his home last night to find his wife and children without food and the notice of dispossession on the door. On the following morning, he drank the poison. The records of many more such cases lie before me. An encyclopedia might easily be filled with their kind. These few I cite as an interpretation of the universe. We are aware of the presence of God in his world, says a writer in a recent English review. The very presence of ill in the temporal order is the condition of the perfection of the eternal order, writes Professor Royce. The absolute is the richer for every discord and for all the diversity which it embraces, says F. H. Bradley. He means that these slain men make the universe richer, and that is philosophy. But while Professors Royce and Bradley and a whole host of guileless, thorough-fed thinkers are unveiling reality and the absolute and explaining away evil and pain, this is the condition of the only beings known to us anywhere in the universe with a developed conscience of what the universe is. What these people experience is reality. It gives us an absolute phase of the universe. It is the personal experience of these best qualified in our circle of knowledge to have experience, to tell us what it is. Now, what does thinking about the experience of these persons come to, compared to directly and personally feeling it as they feel it? The philosophers are dealing in shades, while those who live and feel know truth. And the mind of mankind, not yet the mind of philosophers and of the proprietary class, but of the great mass of the silently thinking men and feeling men, is coming to this view. They are judging the universe as they have hitherto permitted the hierophants of religion and learning to judge them. This Cleveland working man, killing his children and himself, another of the cited cases, is one of the elemental, stupendous facts of this modern world and of this universe. It cannot be glozed over or minimized away by all the treatises on God and love and being helplessly existing in their monumental vacuity. This is one of the simple, irreducible elements of this world's life, after millions of years of opportunity and 20 centuries of Christ. It is in the mental world where atoms or subatoms are in the physical, primary, indestructible. And what it blazons to man is the imposture of all philosophy, which does not see in such events the consummate factor of all conscious experience. These facts invincibly prove religion a nullity. Man will not give religion 2,000 centuries or 20 centuries more to try itself and waste human time. Its time is up. Its probation is ended. Its own record ends it. Mankind has not aeons and eternities to spare for trying out discredited systems. He says, quote, "Such is the reaction of an empiricist mind upon the rationalist bill of fare. It is an absolute no thank you. Religion, says Mr. Swift, is like a sleepwalker to whom actual things are blank." And such, though possibly less tensely charged with feeling, is the verdict of every seriously inquiring amateur in philosophy today, who turns to the philosophy professors for the wherewithal to satisfy the fullness of his nature's needs. Empiricist writers give him a materialism, rationalists give him something religious, but to that religion actual things are blank. He thus becomes the judge of us philosophers. Tender or tough, he finds us wanting. None of us may treat his verdicts disdainfully, for after all, his is the typically perfect mind, the sum of whose demands is greatest, the mind whose criticisms and dissatisfactions are fatal in the long run. It is at this point that my own solution begins to appear. I offer the oddly named thing pragmatism as a philosophy that can satisfy both kinds of demands. It can remain religious, like the rationalisms, but at the same time, like the empiricisms, it can preserve the richest intimacy with facts. I hope I may be able to leave many of you with as favorable of an opinion of it as I preserve myself, yet as I am near the end of my hour, I will not introduce pragmatism bodily now. I will begin with it on the stroke of the clock next time. I prefer at the present moment to return a little on what I have said. If any of you here are professional philosophers, and some of you I know to be such, you will doubtless have felt my discourse so far to have been crude in an unpardonable, nay, an almost incredible degree. tender-minded and tough-minded. What a barbaric disjunction. And in general, when philosophy is all compacted of delicate intellectualities and subtleties and scrupulosities, and when every sort of combination and transition obtains within its bounds, what a brutal caricature and reduction of highest things to the lowest possible expression is it to represent its field of conflict as a sort of rough-and-tumble fight between two hostile temperaments. What a childishly external view. And again, how stupid it is to treat the abstractness of rationalist systems as a crime and to damn them because they offer themselves as sanctuaries and places of escape rather than as prolongations of the world of facts. Are not all our theories just remedies and places of escape? And if philosophy is to be religious, how can she be anything else than a place of escape from the crassness of reality's surface? What better thing can she do than raise us out of our animal senses and show us another and a nobler home for our minds in that great framework of ideal principles subtending all reality which the intellect divines? How can principles and general views ever be anything but abstract outlines? Was Cologne's cathedral built without an architect's plan on paper? Is refinement itself an abomination? Is concrete rudeness the only thing that's true? Believe me, I feel the full force of the indictment. The picture I have given is indeed monstrously oversimplified and rude, but like all abstractions, it will prove to have its use. If philosophers can treat the life of the universe abstractly, they must not complain of an abstract treatment of the life of philosophy itself. In point of fact, the picture I have given is, however coarse and sketchy, literally true. Temperaments, with their cravings and refusals, do determine men in their philosophies, and always will. The details of systems may be reasoned out piecemeal, and when the student is working at a system, he may often forget the forest for the single tree. But when the labor is accomplished, the mind always performs its big summarizing act, and the system forthwith stands over against one like a living thing, with that strange, simple note of individuality which haunts our memory, like the wraith of the old man, when a friend or enemy of ours is dead. End quote. All right, so some of the language in this book sometimes can be a little tricky to follow, but philosophers are prone to do that. But it's an interesting condemnation of philosophers as essentially crafting obscure theories in ivory towers that view the pain and suffering of the common people below as some sort of completion that makes the universe whole. I can definitely understand the criticism that philosophy needs to come down to earth and deal with people in a way that they can comprehend, in a way that they can absorb some of the philosophical ideas and try to use those ideas to make their lives better and to make their capacity to withstand the struggles of life better and perhaps to ease some of those struggles. I think that there is a problem that we face as lay people. I'm not a professional philosopher. Yeah, I'm not a professor. When we are seeking answers to questions like the meaning of life, or, what should I do? What should I do with myself? What am I, etc. And when we're looking for these answers and we go to religion to find an answer, and we get told that the earth was created in, 6,000 years or something, and we were made in the Garden of Eden, and then we come to find out that's not true. Now, I understand back before science arose, we kind of just made it up as we went along because we didn't really know, and so I think we could be forgiven for that. But when we're told about this given this narrative, and we've got multiple religions giving competing narratives, and how are we supposed to take that and say and absorb it and say, yeah, sure, that's correct. And so if we go to the philosophers to say, well, what is life all about? What is the meaning of life? And we're told something like, it depends on what the word is means. And actually, the word is doesn't mean anything at all, because words have no meaning. Have a nice day. It's like, that's not really helpful. So I think that there can be some real valid criticisms of philosophy as not coming down to the real material world and concerning itself with real people and real problems, and adopting the notions of everyday people into their systems. Now, whether or not that really lays the framework for pragmatism, I might be a little skeptical, but regardless, I think it's an important point to make, and he makes it pretty well. He's actually, William James, the author of this, is actually reading from a pamphlet written by Morrison Swift, and so Mr. Swift really lays the condemnation quite strongly. But anyway, let's keep moving. At this point, I think it's important to get into the meat and potatoes of what pragmatism is. And I'm not sure that my interpretation of pragmatism is exactly the sense of pragmatism that William James or other pragmatists may have. I have my own interpretation of this. I think it's accurate, but it seems like kind of more comprehensible to a non-philosopher. So let me just propose a few theoretical mental games that we can work our way through. Pragmatism is largely a question of what is true. It's an exploration of truth. And so what I like to think, I've got a few examples that I think illustrate the question of truth. So, for example, I might say I have 2 shoes on my floor. After I come home and I take off my shoes and I set them on the floor, I might say I have 2 shoes on the floor. And for most practical purposes, we would say that's true. Someone could enter my room, see the shoes on the floor, and say, yes, you do have 2 shoes on your floor, and we could accept that as true. But if I've had these shoes for any length of time, I've been walking around with them, and the soles of the shoes have worn down. And so there's missing an amount of the sole. Where is that? Well, it's scattered across all the different places that I've walked. Bits and tiny little bits of the soles of my shoes are, at my workplace and maybe in my car and on the sidewalk in front of my house, etc. And so, if I were to look at the shoe, I might say, okay, 0.1% of the shoe is no longer attached to my shoe. It's elsewhere. And so if I consider that there's part of my shoe out there in the world, then how could I say I have 2 shoes in my room? Because I really have like 1.98 shoes in my room, and the other 0.02% or what have you is out and about in the world. Now, can we say with any certainty it's 0.01% of my shoe? Or is it 0.010003%? How precise can we be with the quantity of shoe that is not on my shoe any longer? Well, you start getting into the questions of precision. Now, if I want to say that I have 2 shoes on the floor, I don't want to have to go outside with tweezers and find every little piece of shoe and measure it, right? That's totally impractical. So I say I have 2 shoes on the floor, and we accept that as true, even though it's not absolutely meticulously accurate, because it's an approximation. It's the approximations that we use to be able to get through our lives, right? Like, for example, say you have a map in your car, in your glove box, and you might say, is the map accurate? Well, it depends on what I need. If I am looking for, say, if I'm looking for the blueprint of my house, and I find a map of the Earth, it might be accurate, but it's not the map I'm looking for. So the map, say I have a map of the United States of America, and it's got highways on it. Now, if I'm going to California, that map is going to get me there, presumably, because the roads shown on the map correspond with the roads that are actually in the real world. But those roads, do they correspond exactly? Well, they're wider on the map than they would be if it was a scale map. The roads would be very, very thin on the map, but we wouldn't be able to see it very clearly. And so it's distorted by widening the roads, and it's distorted by removing, say, minor roads. It might only show the highways and maybe major routes, but it omits smaller roads. But we say it's accurate because it's going to get me where I need to be. Now, if I'm looking for the blueprints for the house I'm going to build, I need a different level of accuracy and a different level of detail. We could say that the map is accurate, but, you know, does it show the doorknobs? Does it show the correct model of doorknob? And is the doorknob to scale? I mean, is it relevant whether the doorknob is to scale on that map? There are going to be distortions in the map. So it's not perfectly accurate, but it's accurate for our purposes. So the statement about the shoes and the statement about, you know, or the map that we might have, they're accurate depending on what we're using them for. And along the same lines, like time is divisible into very, you know, infinitely small subdivisions. I might say I got home at 5 o'clock, but did I get home exactly at 5 o'clock, or was it 5 o'clock in 1 second? Does it matter? If I got home at 5:30, is that close enough to say I got home at 5 o'clock? What if I got home at 5:01? Can I say I got home at 5 o'clock? Where's the distinction that we draw to say that it's true that I got home at 5 o'clock? If the clock says 5 and not 5:01, then we could say, okay, well, then you got home at 5 o'clock. But what about the seconds if the clock doesn't show the seconds? Do we approximate? Well, the clock approximates for us, and so we trust that that's a level of approximation that we're all going to be happy with. And so the ideas that we have about the world and the statements that we make about things, and even scientific measurements, are largely approximations to some greater or lesser degree. And when we see things, those are approximations as well. You can't see the atoms in your hand. You can't even see the cells in your hand. All you can see is your hand, because your eyesight isn't precise enough to be able to see the particular details. So it's sort of an approximation of your hand that you see. It's an approximation of everything that you see and experience, tactile, everything else is sort of a approximation of reality. And our scientific measurements of mass, I mean, unless you're calculating the mass of every single atom, you're generally coming up with an approximation. And the atoms of an item might be rubbing off, blowing away in the breeze. I mean, if you smell something, you're picking up atoms from that thing. So atoms from things are continually eroding away from it, or changing in one way or another, decaying or breaking down, or new atoms are added to it from foreign substances, etc., etc. I mean, we just in general do not have a perfectly precise observation or understanding of the things around us. And so we need to approximate in order to function, and we determine whether or not something is truthful based on whether or not it fulfills the purposes that we have set out for it, and whether or not it corresponds with our, whether our approximate statements correspond with our approximate observations to an acceptable approximate degree. And that's the way it is. That's kind of, we're kind of floating in a sea of approximations because we're limited creatures and we cannot directly perceive perfect reality in its entirety. And so our ideas about reality, from simple statements like there are two shoes on my floor, to statements like Democrats are pushing socialism, or Republicans are racists, or what have you. They're approximations that serve as a sort of shorthand to explain our understanding of the world. And so we're continually dealing in various sorts of shorthands and various sorts of simplifications and approximations of reality in order to be able to deal with it effectively. And I think that's at the core of pragmatism. All of these notions that we have are some form of approximation, and we need to be considering mostly whether or not they are effective in pursuing our goals, in pursuing our objectives, and whether or not they are corresponding with each other, so that we don't have two notions that conflict with each other, two approximations that cannot both be true, or that we cannot adhere to both of them without some sort of modification, either giving up one of them or the other of them, or finding an external framework that allows them to both be true. And so that's kind of the core of pragmatism as I understand it. And so I'm going to read a few parts of his. He's got a section when he opens up his second lecture. The second lecture is entitled "What Pragmatism Means," and he opens it up with a story, a simple little story, and it in some way illustrates what I'm talking about. He says, quote, "Some years ago, being with a camping party in the mountains, I returned from a solitary ramble to find everyone engaged in a ferocious metaphysical dispute. The corpus of the dispute was a squirrel, a live squirrel, supposed to be clinging to one side of a tree trunk, while over against the tree's opposite side a human being was imagined to stand. This human witness tries to get sight of the squirrel by moving rapidly round the tree, but no matter how fast he goes, the squirrel moves as fast in the opposite direction and always keeps the tree between himself and the man, so that never a glimpse of him is caught. The resultant metaphysical problem now is this: does the man go round the squirrel or not? He goes round the tree, sure enough, and the squirrel is on the tree, but does he go round the squirrel? In the unlimited leisure of the wilderness, discussion had been worn threadbare. Everyone had taken sides and was obstinate, and the numbers were even on both sides. Each side, when I appeared, therefore appealed to me to make a majority. Mindful of the scholastic adage that wherever you meet a contradiction you must make a distinction, I immediately sought and found one as follows. Which party is right, I said, depends on what you practically mean by going round the squirrel. If you mean passing from the north of him to the east, then to the south, then to the west, then to the north of him again, obviously the man does go round him, for he occupies these successive positions. But if, on the contrary, you mean first being in front of him, then on the right of him, then behind him, then on his left, and finally in front again, it is quite as obvious that the man fails to go round him. For by the compensating movements the squirrel makes, he keeps his belly turned toward the man all the time and his back turned away. Make the distinction, and there is no occasion for any farther dispute. You are both right and both wrong according as you conceive the verb to go round in one practical fashion or the other." End quote. Now, what I like about this little story is that it illustrates that these groups of people that he's describing are arguing emphatically with each other about whether the man goes around the squirrel. And during the entire course of the argument, it is very likely, at least, that they were not sharing the same understanding of the phrase "to go round." So that one group might think to go around means one thing, and the other group thinks it means something else. But they didn't ever get that out into the open and explore it until the author William James came along and solved their problem. And so there could be a whole plethora of disputes among people that can, to some greater or lesser degree, be boiled down to semantics. What do we mean by the words we say? Or not just that, but a different conception of reality, a different temperament, perhaps, a tough-minded and a tender-minded. Different people with tough-minded or tender-minded conceptions, or temperaments, I should say, might be in a fundamental dispute with each other without ever digging up the notion that they have misunderstandings of the nature of reality. And the people who were arguing about the squirrel, they didn't realize that they had this misunderstanding. And so let's look at words for a minute. A word is a symbol that represents a concept. It's an approximation, in a way, a representation of a concept. And that concept is an approximation of reality. But two people can't directly meet minds, and so they use these words or symbols of approximations of reality to try to hash out what the concept behind the word is and the ways in which the word represents it, and what the underlying reality is that the word may or may not represent. And so there's always this lack of connection between people because of the perpetual approximations and shorthands and symbols that we use to understand and communicate reality. There's no guarantee that when I'm talking to someone or when I'm talking to you, the listener, there's no guarantee that you're hearing what I'm saying and conceiving of it in the way that I intend it, because your understanding of words may be slightly different. Even tones of voice. When I say something in a certain tone of voice, you might interpret it as me intending one sort of inflection or concept, that I'm trying to attach some particular emotion or perceptual mode to, or experiential mode to the words that I'm saying, that I might not be intending, or I might be intending one thing and you receive another. How can we ever be certain? And how can we be certain what we're uncertain of? How can we know that we're not really meaning the same thing? As much as we might try to go back and forth, we can't really know. And so that same uncertainty of truth and disputes about truth are rooted in this uncertainty about reality and are rooted in the fact of our approximations. So we're using approximate words to create approximate concepts to represent in an approximate way the reality that we observe through our approximate sensory information. So I think that should be laid out pretty clear at this point. As clear as it's going to get. And so from there, he goes to a bit of a deeper definition of pragmatism. And I'm running toward the end of my show here, so I'm not going to drag this out too much longer. But he says, let's have a look. He says, pragmatism represents a perfectly familiar attitude in philosophy. the empiricist attitude, but it represents it, as it seems to me, both in a more radical and in a less objectionable form than it has ever yet assumed. A pragmatist turns his back resolutely and once for all upon a lot of inveterate habits dear to professional philosophers. He turns away from abstraction and insufficiency, from verbal solutions, from bad a priori reasons, from fixed principles, closed systems, and pretended absolutes and origins. He turns toward concreteness and adequacy, toward facts, towards action, and towards power. That means the empiricist temper regnant and the rationalist temper sincerely given up. It means the open air and possibilities of nature as against dogma, artificiality, and the pretense of finality in truth. At the same time, it does not stand for any special results. It is a method only. But the general triumph of that method would mean an enormous change in what I called in my last lecture the temperament of philosophy. Teachers of the ultra-rationalistic type would be frozen out, as much as the courtier type is frozen out in republics, as the ultramontane type of priest is frozen out in Protestant lands. Science and metaphysics would come much nearer together, would in fact work absolutely hand in hand. He says, quote, "Theories thus become instruments, not answers to enigma, in which we can rest. We don't lie back upon them. We move forward, and on occasion make nature over again by their aid. Pragmatism unstiffens all our theories, limbers them up and sets each one at work. Being nothing essentially new, it harmonizes with many ancient philosophic tendencies. It agrees with nominalism, for instance, in always appealing to particulars, with utilitarianism for emphasizing practical aspects, with positivism in its disdain for verbal solutions, useless questions, and metaphysical abstractions. All these, as you see, are anti-intellectualist tendencies. Against rationalism as a pretension and a method, pragmatism is fully armed and militant. But at the outset, at least, it stands for no particular results. It has no dogmas and no doctrines, save its method. As the young Italian pragmatist Papini has well said, it lies in the midst of our theories like a corridor in a hotel. He says, ideas, which themselves are but parts of our experience, become true just insofar as they help us to get into satisfactory relation with other parts of our experience, to summarize them and get about among them by conceptual shortcuts instead of following the interminable succession of particular phenomena. Any idea upon which we can ride, so to speak, any idea that will carry us prosperously from any one part of our experience to any other part, linking things satisfactorily, working securely, simplifying, saving labor, is true for just so much, true in so far forth, true instrumentally. No particular results then so far, but only an attitude of orientation is what the pragmatic method means. The attitude of looking away from first things, principles, categories, supposed necessities, and of looking towards last things, fruits, consequences, facts. Now, I like that because he's essentially saying that pragmatism is more of a method. It's a method by which we seek to grasp the realities around us in the material world by as close of an approximation as we can, and we allow them to we allow our truths to correspond and form in a way that is coherent, but always with an eye toward results. So, how does your map get you where you're going? This is what it comes down to. We approximate truths in order to acquire results, because if we didn't, we would get nowhere and we would accomplish nothing. The different particular methods that we use of approximation, the shorthand we use, may be different. How one person conceives something or creates a shorthand may be different than how another person creates a shorthand, but the real test is, does this map or shorthand get you to where you need to be? And so in that sense, it's an instrumental policy. It's about the truths are evaluated by their results. And I think that for me, there's an important point here that it may not be the point that William James is trying to make, but it's the point that I want to make, which is that if you, like, let's take an example, really simple example. If you have someone who has good intentions, but acts in a way that has unintentionally bad results, and then you have someone, and let's say the good intentions are, adding to the benefit of humanity. His intention is to better the world, but the result of his actions harm people instead of helping them. You might say, well, it's the thought that counts. His heart was in the right place. And we tend to evaluate people and activities largely according to their intentions. And then you have, on the other hand, someone who has maybe a selfish intention, what we might consider a bad intention. This is depending on our meanings of good and bad. But let's say an intention of increasing his personal power, a selfish intention solely toward increasing his power, and his activity has unintended positive consequences. We tend to view the former more forgivingly than the latter, because we as a society have this tendency to place intentions as the core of our moral guides. Does someone have a good heart? Do they have good in their heart? Or do they have evil in their heart? What is their intentions at? That's our moral measurement. That's our moral ruler, or our yardstick. And I think that pragmatism is a thorough rejection of that and says we should be measuring actions by their results. And what someone's intention is largely irrelevant. We're concerned with results. If a belief system has the results we're looking for, then it's good because it's doing what we want to be done. And not concern ourselves with intentions nearly as much. I wouldn't say maybe we don't concern ourselves with intentions at all, but the proof is in the pudding, and it's results that we concern ourselves with primarily. And I think that's a realist approach, and I think that's a tough-minded approach, and I think that's a pragmatic approach, and I like it, and that's one of the reasons I like pragmatism. And to be honest, it's kind of fuzzy because, for me to say that, well, if you prefer to believe that everyone is lying to you and the earth is really flat, then that's true for you. That sounds a little dodgy, right? Like, is that really true for you? Is that such a thing? Like, the earth is round. It's not like true to be one thing for one person and true to be something else for somebody else. And I think that there's a sort of a social truth that we have to adopt. But I think that we also need to have the humility to say that at a certain point in time, it was understood that the world was flat. And at a certain point in time, it was understood that the sun went around the earth. And we look back now and say, well, that's not true. Because we as a society have encountered new information that we had to reckon with. And our truth, our shorthand truth, had to correspond more closely with the other information that we acquired. And it's possible, unlikely, but possible, that somehow some of the things that we understand about the world might turn out to be false. Now, this is a delicate area because you run the risk of unraveling the very concept that truth is supposed to correspond with actual material reality. But truth can never be reality. A map can never be perfectly accurate. The only perfectly accurate map of reality is reality. And so all we can truly know is that we are in the process of refining our maps of reality to the best of our ability. Anyway, there's a lot of food for thought there. And I certainly don't want to introduce pragmatism as some way of undermining our collective trust in science to provide us with truth. I just want to keep the notion of skepticism about what people, the things that people are willing to call true, or willing to operate as if they were true. Always rely upon some degree of shorthand, and the shorthand or approximation may be minuscule, like the Earth is not exactly round, or it may be massive. And I guess I'm going to leave it at that. Check out my Facebook page. I'll be posting more stuff about all these different topics. You can find me on Twitter at Neofusionist. You can find me on Patreon/Neofusionist to support the show, and I look forward to continuing our discussion next time around. Bye.